and welcome to the Business of Data podcast. I'm your host, Catherine King, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today. In this series, we'll be speaking to senior data analytics leaders to share their experiences, challenges, and insights. Let's go ahead and dive straight into today's episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Business of Data podcast. This week we are going to be chatting all about analytics strategy and digital transformation. Now, my guest today is the wonderful Martin Campbell, who is the Chief Information Officer for World Vision. Now, Martin has a Master's in Engineering, Science and Technology from Oxford University. He is passionate about finding big opportunities to use technology to do good. And in his spare time, Martin is also the production manager for NYMO's Lumus and Lux program of events, as well as various one-off specials, which you'll probably notice by his fantastic camera that he's got there joining us today. Hi, Martin, how are you doing?
Hi, very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to have you here. Now, my first question, as is the Bod Pod tradition for any regular listeners, they always want to know a bit of a personal insight first. Now, I think your LinkedIn header sums you up quite well, and I'm just going to read it for the audience there. You say you're an entrepreneur, an author, and also a dungeon master. Why did you want to include the D&D title in there? I love that.
Brilliant. I think probably we should just explain what Dungeons and Dragons is in one sentence for
Yeah,
those who are not familiar.
Everyone might not know.
So Dungeons and Dragons is a very old game. It's a tabletop role-playing game where it's kind of a mix between like the strategy of chess with kind of improv and role play and making up silly stories with friends. So it's been around for a very long time. It's having a little bit of a renaissance at the moment. But the reason, why I have it in my LinkedIn title, I think probably two reasons. The first is I am a professional dungeon master. So I have a little service called motleyfrank.com where you can log in, you can book me for parties, weddings, whatever you want to. If people want to play Dungeons and Dragons they've never played, it's a little bit intimidating to get started with. So you can book a dungeon master to come and run a game for you, and that's a service that I offer. But actually, why do I put it on my LinkedIn profile? I think it's quite a geeky thing to do. But you know, it's one of the many aspects of geek culture. I think us geeks need to stand up for ourselves and be proud. So this is my proud waving of the geek flag, basically, on LinkedIn.
I love that. No, I think that's fantastic. So many people, and the reason I love doing these podcasts is I get to really find out more about the thought leaders, but beyond the data and insights and analytics, it's actually them as people, and you really get to unlock passions and kind of the wider interests as well. So I think that's fantastic, and I love that you're so open with that. And I don't think it's geeky at all. I think it's fantastic.
Geeky is good.
Yeah, exactly. Geeky is good. We like that here at the Business of Data. So the World Vision, who you work for, has a real impact on children all over the globe. Now, would you start off by telling everyone a bit about what you guys do for those who aren't perhaps as familiar with the charity?
Absolutely, yeah, and many in the UK wouldn't be, because World Vision in the UK isn't as big as it is in other countries. But in fact, it is one of the world's largest NGOs, non-governmental organisations, and it focuses on transforming the lives of the world's most vulnerable children. That's our kind of tagline. And what that means is essentially we do three things. We do the sort of traditional disaster response. So when something very bad happens, without notice, we will go in and provide immediate relief for those in danger, particularly for young people in that situation. So situation like the Lebanon explosion very recently would be a good example of that. We also do long-term development work, so going into areas where there are the traditional development challenges around food security, around education, you know, in developing countries, and then we do the piece in between, which is what we call fragile contexts, children who are displaced, often by war or civil war in particular, in refugee camps or because of natural disasters, who need a longer period of care, but they're not at home. And so really our focus is on children, but of course we reach a lot of vulnerable adults as well through that work. And we work in many, many countries around the world, probably best known here in the UK for our child sponsorship programs, where individual supporters can have a relationship with an individual child while supporting that child's community and seeing what happens over a long period of time, which is a really exciting thing to do.
Fantastic. Well, like I say, thank you so much for joining us today. And I always love talking, especially with the charity sector, because it really brings home how important the work is that the data analytics and information community does, because it is in many cases a matter of life or death. So let's set the scene for this discussion then. What have you been working on over the last 2 years? I suppose to focus that question, what's been your biggest achievement to date in your role?
Yes, and 2 years, of course, because I've been here at World Vision for almost exactly that period of time. And prior to that, I'd worked on the commercial end of the charity sector and doing some other things as well, sort of building and running businesses. But this is my first role in a charity, and so it's tremendously exciting for me to sort of hop across the fence. But to sum it up, my brief here at World Vision in the UK as Chief Information Officer is digital transformation. And I also have a small role in one of our international programs, again, leading the same sort of thing. And for the charity sector, really what that means is really taking a look at how recent changes in marketing and communications, and by recent, I mean over the last couple of decades, have really transformed many industries. And the charity sector often tends to lag behind those other industries, not through laziness, but because in a commercial organization, of course, you can take a gamble and you can say, we think this is going to be big, we're going to go invest in it, we're going to get some venture capital to do that. In the charity sector, we can't do that. We have to go for things that we know work. But these days, we know digital works, we know that data analytics is fundamental to good decision making, and so we're now making very big strides into that area. And so really that's been where I focus. First of all, getting the basics right, really making sure that teams are using the data they already have and making sure they're structured to do that. It's a big move from a traditional organization where you used to have a real production line of different things going on, to today's organization where one person can receive the data and make a decision, press a button and cause some things to happen. So you need different structures for that. So partly it's been that, and partly it's been then upgrading our tech to get to the place where we need to be for 2020. We're just in the process now of launching a new digital marketing platform that has analytics at the heart of it, baked in from the beginning, rather than sort of tacked on at the end, which is where obviously a lot of analytics for marketing platforms have found themselves over the years. And it's really just bringing into practice in the charity sector the practice that I've run in startups and high growth companies elsewhere in different industries over the years.
Brilliant. Now, just to pick up on that point about positionality, I find that so fascinating that that level of experimentation perhaps can't occur because of kind of the wider agenda. So do you find yourself looking to any particular industries to see how things are going in terms of innovation, to predict where you might end up stepping? Are there any particular industries that stand out for you in that term?
Well, I mean, the charity sector is often said to be unlike any other industry because the people receiving the service are not the same people as the people who are paying the money. And so it's very difficult with that mindset to draw a comparison. But actually, as I've taken a bit more of a close look at the charity sector, I'm really focused on what we call the supporter proposition. So why would I as a person want to support you as a charity and thereby support those that you serve? And actually, if you look at that, then the business model is very similar to a digital media company, because essentially what you've got there is we as a company as an organization will give you information and data and images and media that make you feel a certain way, and in response you'll give us your money. Now, the reality is, in order to make you feel that certain way, we have to go and do the work. We can't just tell you a great story about someone in Africa and pocket your money. We do actually have to deliver that. But if you look at how you would use analytics and which skills you need and how you would structure the organization, actually, if you look at content, digital content subscription businesses, magazines is where you'd start, newspapers, and look at the changes they've been through over recent years of the shift to online. They've seen a real decline, but then a real renaissance. They've built up more of a movement approach. Think of the Guardian with their founders, or if you look at the more modern organisations offering, free trials. How do you give someone a taste of what it's like to be a charity supporter without actually taking their money. That's quite a challenging thing to do. But those are some of the innovation areas that we're looking to try and do to bring that those sort of modern approaches to life, and of course the data approaches that go with them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. So we are chatting about analytics, strategy, and digital transformation predominantly today. So burning question for me is, how has COVID-19 impacted World Vision's analytics strategy? What have you had to do to pivot? Have you had to pivot? Do you think that things are going to be different for you life after the pandemic because of this?
Yeah, it's been a huge change for us. I mean, the charity sector has been hit very hard by the pandemic, particularly with a lot of forms of fundraising dependent on people coming together as a community. And so, you know, the high street charity shop that we all know very well, or the charity events, the marathons and 5Ks and all these things that many charities runs have really impacted many charities. World Vision, as a sort of particular example, is really focused into this regular monthly gift, the sort of direct debit approach. And so we've been less impacted in terms of our short-term sort of income, and we've been able to carry on running our existing programs, and of course mount the biggest response in our history to COVID itself, because that's now becoming such a huge, you know, issue in poorer countries without the kind of healthcare and without the ability to wash your hands regularly and the other things that we now do as a matter of course. But the thing that has changed most of all is where we start our relationship with new supporters. So previously we had a number of channels that were where we sort of started these conversations. We'd be speaking to people in a shopping centre. We have like an experiential thing that goes into shopping centres. We can come and experience our work through looking at a sort of before and after piece, a sort of installation piece. And of course with shopping, you know, that was completely shut down for most of the last 5 months. We closed down with lockdown, and we've only opened that experience up again. It's had to be re-engineered over the last few weeks. So that's completely changed things. A lot of our support also comes from other organisations through churches, and of course churches have been forced to close their doors and then only gradually reopen recently. So that's derailed a whole bunch of things. Also reach people through events, concerts again. So lots of things have been cancelled.
So many avenues closed.
Absolutely. The interesting part of all of that is the one thing that we have continued to do is to find new supporters online.
Right.
And I think the interesting thing about that is, well, really, you know, it's twofold. Firstly, you know, I've been saying for years, the writing's on the wall, digital is going to be our biggest channel before too long. It was already getting to be our biggest channel, actually, of reaching new supporters before COVID. But with the arrival of lockdown, never mind the writing on the wall, we just slammed straight into the wall at high speed. It was the only thing that was happening. But not only that, actually, whilst it refocused all our internal efforts on digital, it also really led to a lot of folks who were then sitting at home, and they were, you know, watching daytime TV and seeing our ads and going online and interacting with us. So we saw an increase in supporters online through lockdown, partly we think through availability, that people just had a bit more time to look at that, but also I think because our approach to charity over recent years has been, it's kind of been sort of chipped away. There's a lot of popular press that loves to sell newspapers by you know, sort of taking side swipes at people, and charities certainly aren't immune to that. And so you'd see a lot of people say, oh, I don't give to charities, I don't think the money goes where it's supposed to, or whatever. And I think there was just a feeling of, you know, we're okay, we don't need to worry about those other people. And of course with COVID, we've all been in a situation where actually we're a lot more vulnerable than we thought. And I think many people have had the experience of actually becoming reconnected with their own community. I mean, certainly in my street, I've spoken to people in the last 5 months that I've not spoken to since I moved here 6 years ago.
Absolutely.
And
same for us as well,
and we're there for each other, and you're seeing people, you know, with these WhatsApp groups that are now continuing, and we're borrowing each other's lawnmowers, and it's, you know, it's all very English and whatnot, but there's a real sense of actually being a part of a community is a really important thing now. And of course, I think the other thing is we've realized that just because it happens on the other side of the world doesn't mean it doesn't affect us. We really had that around home. And so I think people are thinking, actually, if COVID-19 takes a hold in Africa or in Southeast Asia, then we'll never be rid of it. We have to actually support these efforts to eradicate this thing worldwide, because it's a worldwide issue. And so there's been the rough and the smooth there. We've seen some real problems, and we've seen some real opportunities. Of course, the data coming through has been coming through much more quickly on the digital side than it would through traditional channels. So that's really helped us in terms of we know things much more quickly than we did previously. But of course, that's then placed.
I just wanted to jump in on that point, actually, Martin, because you raised a fantastic thing there. I mean, you described it as being slammed into a wall, into this digital transformation. You were at A and suddenly you're at, K rather than A to B to C. And how has been the team's response to this? Because were you remote based previously? Were you office based previously? How were you kind of working towards this digital transformation? And then what has been that transition over these last few months to suddenly, where your data is coming from is completely changed. How you get all your funding from your charity has completely changed. Basically, everything has changed day to day for you. Yeah. What has that been like for your team and you in terms of that transformation?
I think it's been mixed. I think, it's been difficult for all of us just because of the personal uncertainty and the personal risk. And we've all been, experiencing that in a very negative way. I think now looking back on it, we can see that, for some, I mean, for people like myself, when I said I moved into my current house 6 years ago, and when I did that, I was already doing a lot of work from home. So I set things up so I had an office space, and here I am, where it was very convenient to sit and have a video call, and that works really well. And so I was already geared up to do that. And for me, it was the biggest change was remembering that everybody else I called wasn't going to be in the office; they were going to be at home as well. And so it really didn't change that much. What I saw was actually, I got much more time outside. I wasn't commuting. I was saving money on petrol. I was probably lowering my overall risk because I wasn't driving for miles, which would have been more risky for someone my age. But that's one end of the spectrum. And I think at the other end of the spectrum, we have to recognize that, there are folks who don't have the space at home to work in a comfortable way. Some of my younger team members who live alone were really struggling, and to live alone during this period. I'm fortunate enough to have a house full of girls, and my three girls were all at home. My wife was at home. We were all kind of mucking in, and we have space to do that. But if you're at home alone, or if you have the space, you don't have the space to be separate like that, I think it's tremendously challenging. And I also think that it really depends on how you're set up at work. So if you're already reasonably data driven, then if your accountability is based on, well, did the number move the way the number was supposed to move, then people can shift their working patterns quite a lot and still be clear about what they're achieving and work well. So one of my teams works across several time zones. We have people here in Europe and people in Southern Asia, and we were already fully remote. So we just carried on being fully remote. And there was some of the team that used to get together every 2 weeks. So that's not happening. But other than that, we kind of continue. So the only disruption there has been the personal disruption that people have. But other teams who are just used to being in the office, and it's part of their day, and it's a habit, and it's a social thing, I think people have found that tremendously difficult. So we have to remember that whilst all this working from home is wonderful, we are still, if you like, trading on the investment we made in those relationships when we were all in the same place. And we have to find a way to continue to make that investment. Even if the data's flowing, we still need the human contact. And Zoom's great, but it's not quite there. So I think we've seen that mixed bag. And, from speaking to others, I think that's been the experience. There's
that's
really
really
bad out of this.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you say that, the working so much didn't make too much of an impact on your day-to-day because you had that metric set as to what the KPI and kind of result would be, which is really, really interesting. I think, as you've said there, the companies and industries who aren't perhaps as data-driven, suddenly, having to adapt everything was far more challenging. So I'd be keen to know how involved you would say the C-level data and analytics community has been within your organization with dealing with all of these changes that you've had. I know you lead up the information unit, so how's that relationship been?
It's been good. It's definitely it's forced us to really focus on the numbers a bit more, because we're looking for some certainty here. I think it's been uncomfortable, because what that means is, in a large and diverse organization, many different activities that we have, sometimes it's actually difficult to make equivalence between the performance of one area and the performance of another area purely through numbers. You're after a sort of softer, kind of more complete feel, and in the absence of getting together with people and experiencing that, you don't really see that. I think one of the things that it's really driving, and I actually saw a really interesting McKinsey report about this quite recently, is that the speed of decision making is something that's really being pushed up. So as a charity, it's very common to have a sort of annual planning cycle and a multi-year plan, and many charities would do what we do. But what I was reading, it certainly chimes in with my experience, is that actually the better performing operatives in each industry that they looked at these days were the ones with shorter planning cycles. Where they were looking at sort of more quarterly plans, and what they were seeing during COVID was that everyone's shortening their planning cycles, and those who were already on quarterly are now going to monthly or weekly or 2 weekly planning cycles. And so, that's really difficult to do, because it demands the agendas of those regular meetings that we have completely change, and we have to things that previously we got say in, we now don't get a say in. That is tough for an organization to do. We've certainly struggled with that, and that's something that we continue to work on. Even as things sort of start to return to something a little bit less locked down now, that's still a real focus for us to drive more comfort, more of a sort of, actually this is in my comfort zone, to be looking at numbers and being happy to make decisions quickly, knowing that I'll have a chance to review them again in 2 weeks, rather than having to take quite a lot of care, because I know that once I say yes, then it's locked in for the next 12 months. It's just a different way of thinking, and big change to adjust to.
Absolutely, fantastic. So looking to the future, what sort of projects and innovation have you got in line for the future? I know it's very difficult to predict at the moment, but what are your intentions and plans for the next, say, 6 months?
Well, two main areas of growth really. One is really to take what we've learned in the last few months, and particularly what we're learning week by week as we try out new methods of talking to people, and really build those into our plans, because the high street is not such a hospitable place to anybody as it was before, certainly not to charities, but to shoppers. We are expecting that the high street may be in difficulties moving on. So that needs to be figuring in our plans. So we're looking at how we can do more sort of multi-channel type communications with our potential supporters, and sort of have a conversation with people across a number of engagements, maybe move from the TV to a digital experience to a phone experience, and be able to tie all of those together, which of course has a huge data component. So we're looking at the sort of marketing aspects of that, and looking at sort of redeploying teams there. And some of that's already happening. And we're also looking at the sort of, well, what data do we need to enable that? Because our approach to supporter data, sort of CRM approach, is very much come from the supporter database world, when it was all about the mailings. And so we're struggling with our current systems around how we do these much more granular interactions with supporters, and how we enable many more of our teams to be able to have access to that information, so that they can give a supporter a great experience. So that's going to be a big project for us moving forward, is making the transition there to something that will really bring all that to the surface. And of course that drives such a lot of change in terms of the skills people need, much more data skills, much more sort of self-guided, self-governed work around, here's your target, figure out how to achieve it this month, and it really probably isn't like it was last month. which is just so different from where we were even a year ago, and the majority of the sector.
In terms of those skills, where would you say the data literacy and analytics literacy as well is within the sector?
I mean, there's pockets of excellence all over. I mean, we have some really great people here at World Vision, and many charities would be blessed with similar people. I think that the challenge with today's environment is that it's moved from something that's a bit specialist, where you can just have a few boffins, to something pretty much everybody needs to know the basics of this.
Yeah.
You need to know if that sample size is too small for a statistically relevant sample, a statistically significant sample, and so that sort of base level of A-level stats is something that I think a lot of people are going to have to get their heads around.
Yeah.
In the marketing world, whereas before we didn't need to do that. But I think that's a challenge industry-wide. Actually, there's a long legacy of creative marketing, isn't there? Well, look, we've got this lovely pitch. Your director likes it. Let's spend all the money on that. Mm-hmm. And we're, I was working in a financial technology fintech startup relatively recently, prior to this role, and in that market there were relatively few people who really cut to the heart of this is what the data's telling us. So it's a specialist skill set, but if anybody watching is looking to do that kind of work in an environment that's massively rewarding, then I'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic, love that plug. Awesome. So last question for you, Martin, is if you were to give a fellow Chief Information Officer one piece of advice to help guide them through this turbulent time that we're inevitably going to see over the next couple of months, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, my goodness me. One of the interesting things there is as a CIO, because as I've met different CIO, I made a real point when I became sort of CIO and jumped over the fence into the charity sector of going and meeting other chief information officers. And what I did find was that it's a job description that's very differently understood across the sector. And actually, I think across most industries, there are some CIOs who are very much a head of IT, but the IT has become so important that they need to be there at senior level. Whereas there are some who are glorified heads of digital who have moved up from that side, some with a very broad remit, some with quite a narrow remit. My particular remit is very much to drive through this digital transformation that the board and that our senior leaders have in mind for the organisation. So I think probably the first piece of advice I'd love to have had is figure out what the role actually is, figure out what the specialities are that you're going to need to have, so you can focus in on those, because I think it's very easy to sort of get focused in on the areas that you're comfortable with. That's certainly something I've been guilty of, rather than going, hang on, there's another area here that I'm not so comfortable with, but this really needs attention. So you need to know the scope. And the second thing I think I certainly would have loved to have known is to figure out the speed that is the optimal speed for your organization. Because coming from the data world, from the digital world, as I have digital marketing, you're used to a certain pace, and working in smaller businesses, that pace is very, very fast. Charities, particularly international charities, particularly large international charities, don't move at that pace. And if you try and go too fast, you just break a lot of things, and I think people get very annoyed with you. Equally, if you go too slowly, then you can't make an impact, and you can't make the change that the organisation needs. So I think the judgment of how fast can you go to make the changes that you need to make is really the second thing to figure out. So if anybody knows the answer to that, they could let me know. That'd be really helpful.
I think that's a really interesting point to end on there, because it was something that you brought up earlier as well, is that pace in the sense of making decisions and actually really knowing yourself and knowing your role, and then fitting that along with your organization's kind of wider pace as to whether they're running, walking or jogging, I think is really, really interesting. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been wonderful speaking with you, and I hope we'll be able to catch up soon.
Look forward to it. Thanks ever so much.
What an awesome conversation. I absolutely love the colourful way in which Martin described how he has been thrown into this transformation journey, and actually the very real positionality that Martin's aware of in terms of the charity sector compared to other industries. I think some really exciting things are going to happen in this space, and I loved the hints that Martin was giving there about the new digital experiences that they're going to be working on due to the decrease in volume being seen in the high street. And I think it's a very interesting way of thinking and adapting, which is something that we're all having to do right now. As always, make sure you're subscribed to the Business of Data platform and following us on socials to make sure you are first in line for our thought-leading content. Until next time, stay well, look after yourself, and we'll see you real soon.